The order that changed Texas forever. What turns men under a white flag into targets at dawn? At Goliad, a promise on paper met a hammer in hand. One order traveled faster than mercy. One morning cut through hope like wire. Did that cruelty break the cause or forge it hard? Stay with me. We will follow the trail from a dusty fort to a swampy field where a short battle changed a map. How did a small fort become the hinge of a whole war? The Alamo drew the headlines. Goliad held the map. If you picture Texas in early spring of 1836, think roads, rivers, and time. The Presidio at Goliad sat on the San Antonio River. It guarded a crossing and a junction of trails. Whoever held it could slow armies, feed men, and move guns. That control decided who reached the coast and who reached the towns first. The Presidio itself was old stone. Thick walls, a chapel, and a tight yard for guns. Nearby lay ranch country and scattered farms. The land rolled open toward the coast. Wagons could move there. So could cavalry. But water and fodder were limited by season. In that landscape, a defended crossing mattered more than a pretty banner. Hold the crossing, and you hold a throttle on an enemy's breath. James Fannin commanded the Texan force at Goliad. His men were a blend of veterans and new volunteers. They had a few good cannon. They had a store of powder and shot. They also had wounded men from earlier fights. They were not an army designed to chase. They were an army designed to hold and hurt. From Goliad, patrols could ride to Refugio and to the coast. Couriers could ride to San Felipe and to Houston's growing camp. That web of rides stitched the war together. The Mexican plan split down two lines. Santa Anna pushed inland toward San Antonio and the settlements beyond. General Urrea moved up the coast. The idea was simple. Crush resistance in the center. Sweep the coast. Then link hands and finish the job. Goliad sat between those hands. It could threaten Urrea's flank. It could shelter refugees and guides. It could draw the enemy into costly brush before he reached deep settlements. Logistics turned the key. The coast offered landings for supply. Capano Bay and other points fed Urrea's columns. Roads from those landings ran inland past Refugio and toward Goliad. If Fannin held Goliad, he forced the enemy to guard long lines. He forced them to detach men as escorts. Every escort slowed the spear tip. Every slowed mile bought time for the main Texian army to form. Do you see why a stone post in the brush felt so large? Communication was another edge. News moved by horse. Rumor moved faster. When the Alamo fell, fear rippled east. Goliad could steady that fear by holding firm. Reports from the Presidio told settlers where to flee and where to rally. A held post gave structure to panic. A lost post turned panic into flood. In those weeks, hours mattered. Goliad's lantern of news mattered with them. Fannin also carried a different burden. He had orders to support other posts. He had wounded to protect. He faced enemies in several directions. Each mission call tugged at him. Refugio needed rescue. Victoria offered a safer link toward Houston. The Presidio's strength tempted a stand. The open prairie warned against it. The weight of choice sat heavy. The fact that choice was hard is part of why Goliad mattered. Tactically, the fort and its guns favored defense. The surrounding country favored mobility. That clash shaped every ride out of its gate. Move too slow, and lancers could circle and probe. Move too fast, and wagons and wounded fell behind. Keep the cannon, and you crawl. Leave the cannon, and you lose your teeth. That choice haunted every order Fannin wrote. Each mile from the walls increased risk and reduced options. For Mexico, Goliad promised a message. Take the post, and you break a key nerve in the rebellion. You also show that coastal pushes work. Urrea's early successes had been clean. He aimed to keep them that way. But a stubborn stand at Goliad could bleed him. It could drag the campaign into sieges and mud. Santa Anna prized speed and shock. Any delay risked losing that edge. So both leaders watched Goliad with care. For Texas, the post promised something else. It promised a rally point after loss. The Alamo had fallen with honor. People still needed a place with a flag and powder. Goliad offered that promise. It was not a mythic shrine. It was a working fort. It could feed men, fix guns, and fight. In a young revolt, plain things that worked were gold. A working fort builds belief. Belief builds an army. There is also the power of memory before the fact. The men at Goliad knew about the Alamo. They knew what failure looked like. That knowledge sharpened pride and fear. It shaped letters home and camp talk. It made the Presidio feel like a line that could not bend. When men feel that line tighten, they act with more fire and also more caution. That tension influenced every council and every scout. Later in this video, we will see how orders from the top turned that tension into fate. For now, note the last piece. Terrain near Goliad opens into prairie toward Coleto. The grass there runs wide. The soil can bog wheels after rain. Trees cluster along creeks. A column there is easy to see and hard to shield. If you leave the fort late, you cannot hide on that open ground. If you stop, you invite a ring of steel. So why did Goliad matter more than its walls? Because it sat on a crossroads of roads, rivers, and time. Because it bridged the coast and the heartland. Because it held supplies, guns, and the story people told themselves. Hold it, and you slow a foe and steady your own side. Lose it, and you open a wide door toward your homes. With that in mind, the next step becomes clear. Fannin chose to move. He aimed for Victoria and safety with the main force. He chose to bring guns, wagons, and many wounded. He hoped speed and order could live in the same march. Delay crept in anyway. Oxen tired. Wheels failed. Scouts brought mixed reports. The column rolled out of the safety of stone into the open light. Ahead waited the prairie of Coleto and the first grim test away from the walls. Coleto. March, battle, surrender. Which single pause turned a hard march into a trap? Fannin left the walls with guns, wagons, and wounded. The road toward Victoria looked simple on a map. It was not simple under tired oxen and wet ground. The column started late. Then it slowed more. Men cut brush from axles. Teams balked at low swales. Scouts rode back with dust still on their hats. Each stop felt small. Together they formed a chain. Fannin wanted to save his men and the guns. Those guns were pride and power. They also weighed like anchors. Every creek crossing 8 times. Wheels sank. Ropes snapped. Men heaved and cursed and pushed. The sun climbed. A wide prairie opened ahead. That prairie had a name. Coleto. It looked kind. It was not kind to a slow train. Midday came. The oxen blew hard. The wounded begged for a halt. Fannin called a rest on open ground. The pause fit the needs of men and beasts. It did not fit the danger. Brush and timber lay beyond the prairie edges. Lancers could form there without being seen. Uraya's advance units had moved fast for days. Their riders knew those lines of cover by heart. Dust on the horizon told the next chapter. Riders appeared in several groups. Muskets glinted. Lances flashed. Drums carried flat across the grass. Fannin ordered a square. Companies moved with drills learned on other fields. Wagons and guns filled the gaps. The square faced out with rifles and 2 small cannon. The men were tired but steady. The prairie gave clear fields of fire. It also offered no water and no shade. Skirmishers felt for weak places. Mexican infantry came on in bounds. Lancers probed for a side that moved slow. The first volleys were crisp. Shot tore into the leading files. The square held. Then artillery appeared against them. Mexican guns opened at range. The square answered with its own small pieces. The fight turned into a duel across hot grass and trampled weeds. Smoke drifted. Men coughed. Officers paced the line and pointed with short, sharp hands. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Texans had no reserve to plug holes. Every man already stood in the wall of bayonets and rifles. Ammunition carriers crawled under fire to pass cartridges and canister. A few of the wounded tried to crawl to the center. The square bent but did not break. One cannon crew worked bare to the waist, black with powder. Another crew took a hit, and a boy stepped up without a word. The hours ground on. Late day brought a brief lift. A charge of lancers tried to roll a corner. The angle spat fire and held. Horses veered from the bayonets. A riderless horse tore across the square and fell. The men cheered once and then went quiet again. The heat began to drop with the sun. Shadows stretched. Waterskins lay light and empty. Fannin himself took a wound in the thigh. He stayed upright with help and kept giving orders. Night pushed the lines apart. The shooting slowed to sharp, nervous bursts. Both sides pulled back a little. The square lay on its arms. Men licked cracked lips and listened for hooves. A few crawled to gather dropped cartridges and canteens from the dead. Groans carried in the dark. Officers walked the interior and spoke low. They counted cartridges. They counted men still able to stand. They looked at the guns and saw that the axles had new cracks. Across the prairie, Araya's officers counted too. They sent for more men and more guns. They set pickets tight. They planned to ring the square at dawn. Their skirmish lines would creep closer under dim light and grass. Their artillery would move in to better ground. They had the advantage of water and fresh legs. They had the edge of numbers and the use of terrain. They did not want to waste those edges in a rash attack. At first light, the ring tightened. Mexican artillery came up and began to speak. Their fire was more accurate now. The Texan cannon answered, but with fewer rounds. Water had run out in the night. Wounded men begged for a sip that did not exist. Some fired from their backs with set jaws. A corner of the square lurched when a ball hit a wheel. Men rushed and braced it with fence rails and rope. They held, but the cost rose each minute. Fannin and his officers met in the center. They faced a short list. Ammunition low. Water gone. Wounded heavy. No way to move the guns. No cover anywhere. Break out on foot and leave the hurt. Or hold and be ground down. Or seek terms and hope for honor. Do you choose pride or survival when both look thin? The council reached for a third path. They would ask for terms that treated them as prisoners of war. They believed regular officers across the field would honor those terms. A white cloth went up. Firing slowed and then stopped. Mexican officers came in with firm faces and measured words. The Texan officers stated their request. Treatment as prisoners of war. Protection for the wounded. No harm to non-combatants. Transfer to Matamoros and eventual parole. The talks moved with the stiff pace of men who had bled each other. The situation on the ground favored the side with water and guns. That fact pressed on every sentence. The agreement that followed read like hope in ink. The Texan officers believed they had secured fair treatment. Some Mexican officers agreed in spirit. Others spoke more cautiously about higher orders and policy. The rank and file heard only that the fight had ended. Weapons were stacked. Men sank to the grass and closed their eyes. Relief washed through the square like rain that did not exist. Companies were formed again and marched under guard toward Goliad. The wounded went in carts and on doors used as stretchers. The road back crossed the same prairie that had burned them. Some looked down at the ground and tried not to think. Others looked back and tried to fix the scene in memory. The Presidio walls rose again at last. Prison registers opened. Cells filled. Rumor filled them faster. Here lies the hinge. The men believed they had bargained for life. They had not bargained with the only man whose will would count. Santa Anna's policy on invaders waited like a sealed letter. The next chapter would open that letter. It would show how orders outran mercy and how mercy tried to run after them. The field of Coleto had ended in a surrender that felt safe. Inside the Presidio, safety would prove to be a word with a short life. The death order. Who made the choice that turned hope into doom? Inside the Presidio, the men waited with faith in their terms. They stacked arms. They cared for the wounded. They wrote short letters in cramped script. They trusted that officers on both sides would honor a deal. Then a different set of papers began to move. Those papers carried a colder plan. Months before, Mexico had set a rule for this war. Foreigners who came to fight without papers would be treated as pirates. Pirates did not get prisoner rights. Pirates faced death. Santa Anna held that rule like a hammer. He had just taken the Alamo by storm. He wanted the revolt over fast. He believed fear could end it sooner than mercy. He believed hard examples could save future blood by breaking will now. General Araya saw things on the coast in a different light. He captured men at Refugio and elsewhere. He marched fast and fought often. He found that fair treatment made the next town easier. He also found that many captives were not wild pirates. They were farmers and clerks in rough coats. Some had families in Texas. Some had papers from provisional leaders. Urrea wrote in that spirit. He argued for parole. He urged respect for surrender terms given at Coleto. Meanwhile, couriers rode between camps with orders and reports. The chain of command in that spring moved on horseback. Time and distance bent the chain. A message sent on a clear plan could arrive to a muddy camp where facts had changed. That is what happened here. Urrea sent views that leaned toward mercy. Santa Anna sent orders that aimed at death. Which letter would reach the man at Goliad first? Which voice would he obey if they clashed? Colonel Portilla commanded at the Presidio. He had the prisoners in his care. He also had a stack of notes from above him. Some told him to treat the men as prisoners of war. Some told him to prepare for a harsh measure. He knew the decree about foreign invaders. He knew the reality on the ground. He saw wounded boys and skilled artisans. He also saw a war that needed obedience. He was a soldier under orders in a tight frame. Santa Anna did not like mixed signals. He sent a clear order as the week closed. Execute the prisoners. Do it at once. Do it under the decree. The word came through higher staff and then down to the Presidio. It arrived after days of rumor in the cells. It arrived after men had settled into a tired routine of hope. It arrived when Irea was out toward Victoria, still herding the war forward along the coast. Portilla faced a hard night with those pages in hand. He knew Irea's views. He knew Santa Anna's will. He also knew his own oath. Some officers urged delay. Others said that delay would be defiance. He read the order again and again. He weighed the risk of sparing men against the risk of disobeying the head of state and the general of the army. He wrote a reply that noted the conflict. Then he prepared to act. Have you ever felt two duties pull you at once? The men in the cells felt a gentler pull in that same hour. They had begun to hope for a move to Matamoros. They traded bits of food and rough jokes. They pressed cloth to wounds. A few had been assigned small tasks outside the walls and had returned. Those small mercies made terms feel real. They did not know that staff officers had turned words like mercy into words like example. The logic behind the order was cruel and tidy. Crush the revolt by fear. Mark the men as pirates, not as soldiers. Remove the idea that surrender meant safety. Show that those who came from the United States would not be treated as regulars. In that frame, the Goliad prisoners were not a bargaining chip. They were a message. The message would travel faster than any courier. It would race to farms and ferries and river towns in a day. Irea learned of the order too late to stop it. He had written to ask for mercy. He had praised some of the prisoners for brave conduct. He had told superiors that parole would be wiser. But he did not hold the seal that morning. Speed in war gives, and it takes. It gave him wins along the coast. It took from him the chance to stand in that yard and say no. The gap between his pen and the Presidio widened into tragedy. Portilla's final choice followed the chain of command. He would obey the highest direct order. He set plans in motion for dawn. He organized companies by language and strength. He directed officers to form columns of prisoners. He assigned guards to those columns. He kept the Texan officers inside for a separate fate. He tried to keep the procedure neat, even as his hand shook when he signed the last note. Later in this video, we will walk that dawn step by step. For now, see the gears that locked. A decree from the capital. A leader who prized terror as a tool. A field commander who favored honor but was not present. A local commander torn between two bosses. Add slow roads and faster fear. Add mixed messages after a surrender made in good faith. The result was a machine that fed on men who had trusted words. Some will argue that war leaves no clean choices. Others will say that Portilla could have stalled and saved many. Both views have weight. What matters for the story is what he did, not what he might have done. He chose the strict path of obedience. He chose it at a time and in a place where mercy needed courage. He chose it with his name on papers he would keep for years. Those papers would live on as a record of the order and the day. The prisoners slept under that shadow without knowing it. Guards paced. Officers whispered in corners. The town around the Presidio settled into a quiet that comes before a storm. The sky began to pale in the east. Somewhere a rooster crowed. A bugle sounded inside the walls. The men stirred and reached for worn hats and for canteens that held little. They thought it was another day and a long wait. It was not another day. The order had crossed the last gate. The choice at the top had reached the men at the bottom. At first light, guards walked to the cells and called names. The columns formed. The lines turned toward the river road and toward the open brush. Inside the yard, the officers remained. Outside the walls, muskets worked their way to the ready. The letter that had traveled so far was about to speak in fire. Palm Sunday at Goliad. What looks like a simple roll call can hide a trap. Dawn broke pale over the Presidio. The prisoners woke to the usual sounds. A bugle. Boots on stone. Short orders in Spanish. Many thought they were moving to Matamoros soon. They cleaned small wounds. They shared dry rations. They waited for the gate to open on another day of the same. Inside the command room, the plan for the morning was set. Guards would form the men into several marching groups. Each group would leave by a different gate. Each would follow a road out across the low brush. The officers would remain in the yard for a separate handling. The wounded would be kept near the chapel. The routine look of the movement was part of the design. Names were called from lists. Men filed into ranks by company and language. Some joked to cut fear. Others stared at the dust and said nothing. A few had worked outside the walls in days past and had come back. That memory kept a thread of hope alive. The gates creaked. Sunlight poured across the yard. The first column stepped into the light with guards at both sides. The road sloped toward open ground and thin mesquite. The line moved at a steady pace. Guards kept muskets at the ready, not at the sling. After a short walk, the officer in charge called a halt. He directed the prisoners to face right. They were told to march a few steps into the brush. Then they were told to halt again. The guard line spread out behind them in a loose arc. A few prisoners sensed the change at once. This was not a transfer. This was a killing field. Some whispered a prayer under their breath. Some looked for a break in the brush. A few tensed to run. The order to fire cut across all thought. The first volley slammed into backs and shoulders. Men dropped in rows. Others bolted forward and fell a dozen steps later. Guards reloaded fast and fired again at any who moved. The sound rolled back toward the walls. It carried to the town. It carried to the men still waiting inside the yard. They heard the shots and went still. They looked at one another and read the truth in each other's faces. The second column went out under that weight. They tried to walk like soldiers under guard. They tried to keep fear from breaking the line before the gate. At a bend in the road, several men rushed the brush and made for the river bottoms. A few reached the canebrakes and slid into the water. Others were cut down on the bank. Lancers moved to ring the route and stop more breaks. Would you have tried to run, or taken one more step and hoped for a word of mercy? The guards kept order by motion and by sound. Short words, sharp gestures, muskets raised and lowered with drill hall care. Back inside, the officers called for the commandant. They asked to speak. They argued that terms had been agreed after Coleto. Some begged for their men. Others stood and stared, jaw set. The answer was a firm refusal. The orders were clear. The executions would proceed. The officers would be dealt with last. The order to continue went out to the waiting companies at the gates. The third column left under a hot sun and a thicker cloud of rumor. That group included men who had been nurses or cooks in the makeshift hospital. Some wore bandages. The halt was made near a shallow rise. The line turned again. The arc of guns formed again. A chaplain among the guards made a fast sign of the cross. The volley came. A few fell quietly. Others cried out for water. The shock rolled over the field like heat. Within the walls, the officers heard the distant firing and then the near silence that followed each volley. They were led to the yard and placed before a detail. Fannin came last. He had been wounded at Coleto. He faced the squad with a set face. He asked for 3 small mercies. Spare his face. Aim at the heart. Give his body a proper burial. The squad fired. He fell where he stood. The yard went still after the smoke drifted away. In the town, some civilians watched in horror. A few pleaded for a halt. Others turned away and shut doors. The soldiers kept working through the list. They were not eager, but they were thorough. Non-commissioned officers kept timing. Officers checked names and numbers. The goal was to complete the order before confusion or pity could change the pace. The work of killing was treated like any other duty. By noon the main columns had been dealt with. The guards combed the brush for any wounded who still moved. Some men lay silent and lived by that choice. Others crawled and left trails that drew fire. A handful who reached the river hid under cut banks. They waited with faces pressed to wet clay while riders searched above. Hours later, they slipped away through the reeds and began slow journeys toward safety. The dead lay in lines and in ragged clusters. Some bodies were burned in piles near the roads. Others remained where they fell. The smell of powder and blood pulled flies. The sun lowered and cast long bars of light across the field. Back inside the Presidio, lists were closed and sealed. The commandant wrote a report that the decree had been obeyed. He signed his name with a steady hand and a heavy heart. A small group of prisoners had not been placed in the columns. They were artisans and doctors kept for labor. A few boys and a few men with needed skills were pulled from the ranks. That fact did not change the nature of the day. It only proved that the order left narrow lanes for use and none for mercy. Most who left the gates did not come back through them alive. Toward evening, guards eased. Civilians ventured out to look for kin among the fallen. The river moved on at its slow spring pace. The Presidio walls turned orange in the light. Inside, The remaining prisoners sat in silence. Outside, the town carried the weight of what it had seen. News began to ride east that same night with those who escaped. The word spread faster than any courier's set pace. You can measure a day like this in shots and bodies. You can also measure it in the way it changes the talk in cabins and camps. Men who had wondered about surrender now had an answer. Families who had weighed flight now packed. Commanders who had weighed bold strikes now sharpened a simpler idea. Remember Goliad. The phrase would load the next battle with a charge no powder could match. In the next part, we will track those aftershocks. We will see how the news from Goliad moved troops, councils, and hearts. We will follow the line from this yard to a muddy field east of the bayous. There, a short battle would repay the morning's cost with speed and certainty. The road from this dawn leads straight to that afternoon. Aftershocks. What did one grim morning change by sunset across Texas? The answer starts with speed. News rode on fresh horses. It crossed ferries and prairie and rough towns in a day. By night, cabins east of the Brazos whispered one phrase. Remember Goliad. It was not a slogan yet. It was a warning and a promise in the same breath. Families on the road felt the shock first. The long drift east had already begun. People called it the runaway scrape. Wagons creaked. Children cried. Men looked back from the traces. Word from the Presidio turned fear into hurry. Cross the next river now. Do not wait for the herd. Smoke rose behind them from burned corn and empty barns. They left more than gear. They left a season of hope in the fields. Houston's small army felt a different current. Men had been grumbling at long retreats. Stand and fight, they said. After Goliad, the talk changed color. The ranks wanted a fight that would count. They wanted a fight that would answer. Houston listened. He drilled. He moved toward ground that gave him edges he could use. He knew his line could bite if he picked the hour. The massacre did not give him numbers. It gave him unity of will. Recruiting along the trail sped up. Stragglers who had meant to go home turned back into camp. New riders who had hesitated signed a roll. A few old rifles from cabins came out with fresh flints. Ammunition wagons got pushed a little faster. Quartermasters who had begged for help now got it without words. The army was still small. It was still rough. It was now aimed like a spear, not dragged like a chain. On the Mexican side, the message cut a different path. Santa Anna believed examples end wars. He wanted settlements to see the cost of revolt and fold. Some garrisons cheered the firmness. Others worried about the cost of hatred. Araya, still on the coast, saw a harder road ahead. He had argued for parole and order. Now he knew that every skirmish would carry the taste of revenge. That taste makes men wild at the edges. Wild men make mistakes. Inside councils, paper clashed with passion. Leaders in flight argued over bridges, ferries, and records. Save the archives or save the families. Keep the government moving or stay close to the army. The Goliad news forced choices in hours, not days. Messengers rode in, read the lines, and rode out red-eyed. The small nerve center of a young cause had to function in mud and fear. It did not break. In camp, discipline got sharper. Officers knew that any captured man might face the same fate. That fact closed gaps. Pickets stood longer. Stragglers got pulled in. Drills got shorter and harder. The watchword at dusk remembered two places now. Men said it under their breath. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. The pair of names linked grief to duty in a way no speech could match. When Santa Anna's main body moved near Buffalo Bayou, the spring air felt heavy. Houston scouted low ground and timber. He looked for a place where noise could hide. He looked for a place where a short run would carry men into shock range. The anger in the ranks became a resource only if held tight. He kept it tight. He waited through the hours when a lesser commander would have lunged. The strike at San Jacinto came like a door slam. The cry rose and carried both names. The line ran, fired once or twice, and closed. The rout was fast and total. Many Mexican soldiers died in the flight. Some tried to surrender and were shot in the crush. That is where controversy still lives. Did fury erase restraint? Did men in the line act under orders or under rage? The truth is tangled. The field was chaos. The wounds from March burned hot in April. War is not a clean trade. Houston was hit in the ankle. He still tried to pull his men back to order once the line broke the camp. Prisoners were taken. Many more were killed running. The field itself argued for blood. The names shouted had trained the hand. Yet even in that hour, Command began to reassert. Guards formed. Flags rose. Officers barked hard words, and men obeyed. A wild start ended in a captured president. Santa Anna was taken the next day. He came in a plain coat and tried to pass as a common soldier. Recognized, he faced a ring of men who wanted revenge on the spot. Houston, hurt and pale, stood against that. He ordered protection. He ordered a tent and a guard. He ordered treatment that looked forward, not back. That decision was steel under velvet. It was also cold politics. A living captive could end a campaign in one stroke. The treaties of Velasco grew from that moment. They were not clean. They were argued, signed, and then disputed by Mexico later. But in the short run, they gave Texas a breath. They pulled the main force south and out. They calmed the roads and ferries a little. Families still ran, but some turned and looked west with new hope. A brutal morning at Goliad had set the stage for a short afternoon at San Jacinto that changed the map. Across farms and towns, memory work began fast. Graves were marked as best as people could. Names were listed and argued. Sermons tied lost to duty. Simple markers rose where the roads bent. The story gained a shape. At the center of that shape stood the idea that surrender without honor leads to ruin. That moral taught itself in a single day. Men who rode later wars learned it by ear long before they read it in books. The Mexican army and state paid other prices. The executions darkened their cause in foreign eyes. Support from some quarters cooled. The image of harsh rule stuck. That image made it harder to win hearts on the frontier later. Santa Anna himself gained and lost power many times after. Yet the stain of Goliad never quite washed out. Leaders can win fields and still lose stories. Stories are what nations carry forward. For Texas, the shock forged a grim unity. It did not create virtue. It did create resolve. It taught lessons about command, speed, and the use of terror. Use terror, and you may stiffen the very people you meant to break. Treat prisoners as men, and you might buy quiet with mercy. In that spring, both sides learned which path cut deeper. One choice closed options. The other opened them. Have you ever watched grief turn into action in a single week? That is the arc here. A field of bodies west of the coast gave fuel to a fight near a bayou. A cry at dawn became a charge at afternoon. The next months were still hard. The years that followed were harder still. But the wheel had turned. The new republic would live long enough to make its case upon the world. So what did that morning change by sunset? It changed how men marched, how they fought, and how they treated victory when it came. It changed which leaders could govern a fear that might have broken them. It gave words to a cause that needed spine and not just songs. And it set a lesson down in plain lines. Use cruelty and expect a storm. Answer cruelty, and then hold your hand when the field is won. That is how a nation begins to stand.